on the Times Radio stand at the party conference by Kit Malthouse, Education Secretary. How are you?
I'm fine. You're sounding a bit croaky. You have a busy
croaky.
night last night, did you?
I was yes, shouting at lots of people. How long do you think she's got?
Oh, please, Matt.
So how long do you think she's got?
Well, after today, I think quite a long time, right? So this was, from my point of view, exactly what I wanted to hear, which is a really strong moral statement of the case for growth. You know, we've had a really difficult decade or so as a country, coming out of that massive financial crash, and then a pandemic, now war in Europe, a really challenging backdrop against which, as she said, an acceptance of the status quo is really a dereliction of our duty, particularly to the next generation. And the idea that she wants to go for growth is something that I've been proposing for a long time, and that is really fulfilling our moral obligation to the next generation. So they'll have a strongly growing economy, that they can start businesses, own houses, get jobs, develop skills, all that kind of stuff in the way previous generations have. So I thought it was good. And actually, I'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who would disagree with it.
Everybody I've spoken to claims that they've been pushing for a pro-growth agenda for a long time. You have, Liz Truss has, Kwasi Kwarteng has, the whole cabinet has. And yet, you're talking about 12 years of Conservative-led government. Who was it in the Conservative-led government who didn't like the idea of going for growth?
Oh, so, well, first of all, from my point of view, in your esteemed newspaper, you can go back over a decade and see op-eds that I wrote for you when I was at
my point is,
City Hall talking about this issue.
We've had a Conservative in Downing Street that whole time.
But if you listen to what I said in my first answer, right, we're coming out of a very difficult decade. Right, so we had to, the Cameron government, the coalition, and then after had to address the massive, and I think people underestimate, the massive economic consequences of that crash, right? It's funny how amnesia we all forget, but I was in business at the time. I lived through it, right? I had the sleepless nights, how am I going to pay the payroll, all that kind of stuff. The bank going to pull our facility, all that we lived through. And when the financial system melted down, and don't forget, is the oil in the machine, it took a long time to recover. Thank God we did recover and do that work, because then we went into a massive pandemic where we had to max out the credit card to keep British industry going on furlough and all that kind of stuff. So we've come out of that into now this war and energy price shock, plus this growth in global inflation, which we're struggling with. And as a result, we've got to a stage now where we have to say, look, 21st century, we really have to fulfill our obligation. The status quo now that's become accepted really through the last 3 or 4 years, it's just not an option. We have to break it up and do something new and different if we're going to fulfil that intergenerational obligation. And so I applaud what she said. And I have to say, I'm also very pleased that she was up front addressing the 45p. Right, that would have been easy just to skate over. I don't know about you, but I felt during the speech that there's quite a lot of conviction and courage there. I mean, that interesting anecdote about the plane and the badges, I thought was really indicative of somebody who's feeling something important happening in their youth that they're going to solve when they get older. And so I was pleased. I thought it was a determined speech, and hopefully colleagues will feel the same.
There was rounds of applause. She got rounds of applause to Therese Coffey, Health Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister. Suella Braverman is Home Secretary too. Absolutely no mention of education policy at all. In fact, her only mentions of education were that the school she went to under the Tories was rubbish. And she boasts that she's the first Prime Minister of our country to have gone to a comprehensive school, which isn't true.
Yeah, but that's not true, actually, Matt. So she, if you remember, when she was talking about her family, she talked about learning the power of education and hard work.
There's no education policy. What's the big flagship education policy you're pursuing?
Well, we've got a flagship education policy which we've been pursuing for some time, right? So I said in the...
What is it?
So I said yesterday, and I've said repeatedly, if you look back at the last 12 years, there's lots of things you can criticise the government for, but one of the huge successes is the transformation in our education system, right? So our schools are in a much better position than they were 10 years ago. We've got about 10 million kids.
It's just not the experience of people and their children.
No, completely untrue. That's not correct.
You didn't put forward the amount of money that your own advisor suggested for catch-up after COVID.
You're painting a picture which is just at odds with the truth. Right, so we now, out of 10 million kids, we've got over 8 million in good or outstanding schools. That was 6 million 10 years ago, right? We're 8th in the International Literacy League table, which is our highest score ever, right? We've got 91% of 7-year-olds reading fluently. That was only 50-odd% 10 years ago. So whatever you say about the government, you're a vocal critic, and that's fine. But, education is accepted as having been a success. Now, during the pandemic, things wobbled. Right, so my job is to kind of turbocharge that transformation and complete that mission. The stuff that Michael Gove started and was built on by Nicky Morgan.
He's a more vocal critic than me.
Yeah, that's fine, but built on, not in the education sector, but built on by Nicky Morgan and Justine Greeney and others. Right, that has been a transformation. I was talking to a Vice-Chancellor the other night of a major university in London, And he said they are astonished at the quality of students coming through now compared to what they were getting 10 years ago. So I think you're doing a disservice to those thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of teachers who worked so hard over the last decade, and actually those people who took on the status quo in education a decade ago to bring academisation. It's been a transformation for so many kids. We now have, though, you're right about challenge, we've got about 700,000 kids in what they call double RI, so requires improvement 2 inspection schools. And we're going to drive that down even further with the help of teachers, with the help of the sector. So, no, it's been a huge success.
Let me bring in Lucy Fisher.
Kit Malthouse, you say there's much that can be criticised about the government's record in the past 12 years. And indeed, Liz Truss and many of the front benchers we've heard from this week have done that. You know, today she pointed out how late the previous government was to wake up to the threat from Russia, how much there'd been reliance on other powers for energy security in the UK. We've heard Kwasi Kwarteng talking about managed decline, complaints about the 70-year tax burden that was reached under Boris Johnson. Isn't there a huge risk here with the current administration, trashing the past 12 years of Tory rule when it comes to the next election?
Well, I don't think anybody's trashing the last 12 years. As I say, each government has to operate within the context and the backdrop that it faces, right? So the Cameron coalition government that came in, first of all, didn't come in with a Conservative majority, and secondly, came against the backdrop of this massive global meltdown, right? And people forget that, right? I know it's easy and amnesia. We all move on now. The velocity of social media means I'm sure in a year's time we'll all be sitting here saying, "Oh, do you remember that pandemic thing?" Right? So life moves on quickly, but
what about
politics
the past
doesn't.
3 years then? Let's just focus on Boris Johnson. Why couldn't he have done some of these moves? I mean, many people would say he couldn't have done these tax cuts because they're unfunded and it led to the pound crashing, precipitating interest rates rising, as we've seen in the recent
Well, first of all, he couldn't, because immediately post his election in 2019, we were catapulted into a global pandemic, when, if you remember, we had to put the economy into suspended animation for months on end, right? So there's the first major barrier, which also required us to borrow huge amounts of money, right? But now we're coming out of it normalised, and for better or worse, he's obviously gone.
We haven't paid back that money.
Hold on, but
Boris.
these things don't flip on a night. So some of us were making the case for this some time ago, right? During the tail end of the Boris Johnson administration, and politics starts to shift in a direction. It doesn't suddenly turn overnight. I think the point Liz is making is that we've now come out of the pandemic. We've dealt with the ripples. We're normalising now, and so we can think seriously about what our economy looks like in the 21st century. The economic poles of the earth, we have to face it, are tilting east, right? If we're not going to become a sort of just a modest island off the rocky north coast of Europe, right? We have to do something different, and she is determined to change. Now, we've seen that before in Conservative politics. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was there was a settled consensus about the economy, and the Conservative Party participated in that through Ted Heath, right? And then it was decided, this just isn't working for the next generation, and there was a turn, and that's what I think we're seeing now.
How worried are you that the initial stages of this big reset that she appears to be trying to pursue has gone down so badly with the markets and with the public, and that nobody's ever come back from being 30 points behind? The new YouGov poll today has got Liz Truss, her favourability is worse than it ever was for Jeremy Corbyn. All of the things you want to talk about have been put in jeopardy by the presentation, the management of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so look, I mean, as she herself has said, the pitch rolling wasn't there. There was, I think somebody else said, there's been a kind of communications error, and obviously that is unfortunate, but we are where we are.
Yeah.
Right, and you look back and you think, well, in hindsight, we would have done things differently. Of course, I recognise that. But once the initial reaction, and what's interesting is, the market reaction wasn't necessarily just a mathematical calculation. It was always also a metric of emotion.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
That it's now strengthened. The market's back up. It's up above where it was. The pound has strengthened. They're seeing, I hope today, the power of what she's saying about growth and the future plans that are going to come. I mean, we're working on childcare, what we can do to create more childcare. Very important for lots of families who want to get back to work. They get good, accessible, childcare they can afford that allows them to work. As that comes through, we'll see more and more positive stuff coming through about growth. So, I mean, as I say, what can I tell you? If you think the status quo is an option, fine. Then, as you say, you're heading towards decline, and that is the kind of Starmer line. Now, it's quite an interesting dynamic, actually. If Liz has become the change candidate. What does that make Starmer? Well, Starmer is the status quo. You say, no, we'll go back. We'll go back to how it was. We'll go back to that level of growth. We'll go back to high taxes. We'll go back. It's just not. It's not fulfilling the obligation to the next generation, right? It's not. When you say to people in their 20s, right, we're actually going to give you an economy that's hovering around 1% growth, it's just not good enough. We need to try harder.
Your former cabinet colleague, Grant Shapps, says Liz Truss has got 10 days to show she can turn this around. Do you think she will?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think the case she made today is unanswerable. I can't think of anybody on our benches who would dispute that.
And if
I'd say this is not a good and attractive proposition.
If in 10 days you're still 20 points behind in the polls and she's polling worse than Jeremy Corbyn?
I don't know about polls. I mean, you say there's no turnaround. I remember, 2019, right? So we came out in the May of 2019. We came out of the European elections with 8.8% of the vote.
And you changed leader.
Well, we did change leader, but at the same time, we also
so
changed.
A case of changing leader
changed approach. We bounced forward, but we have just changed leader, right?
Yeah.
Having gone through a very difficult period where our polling wasn't good, and there was a political reaction to that too. Look, in the end, my view is, yes, you pay attention to public sentiment. Yes, you think about the polls, and obviously the objective is to win the election. But in the end, you have to do what you think is right, right? And if you're not doing what you think is right broadly, and the people don't like it, well, that's the game, right? You can't come into politics and pretend to be something you're not. There are too many people doing that already, I'm afraid.
Kit Malthouse, really good to see you. Education Secretary.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you with us.